let's get started. Welcome everyone to our Creative Minds program for the night. My name is Nidhi. Just before we begin, if people could silence their phones, turn off any alarms, maybe make sure you don't start cueing Siri at any point. All things I have witnessed during programs. So we appreciate your help in giving the platform and the stage to the artists and speakers here tonight. To begin, the San Jose Museum of Art acknowledges that we are on the unceded ancestral land of descendants of the Ohlone Nation. The Ohlone Nation is represented by numerous tribes, indigenous organizations, and individuals with whom we strive to build relations. SJMA acknowledges and celebrates the continued presence of our region's multiple communities, expresses gratitude for their guidance and teachings, and pledges an ongoing commitment to listening, learning, and sharing. As well tonight, we'd like to thank the San Jose Downtown Association for providing grant support for the marketing efforts around Christina Fernandez Multiple Exposure, our exhibition on view currently through September 22nd. Through their 2024 Arts Marketing Grant Program. These grants empower arts organizations and event producers to boost their marketing efforts, attracting more visitors to downtown San Jose, and enhancing the utilization of city-owned Park SJ lots and garages in downtown. By the way, Park SJ garages offer 90 minutes of free parking, and the parking website parksj.org is a great resource providing real-time parking availability, maps, and more. We're really excited to partner with downtown organizations like San Jose Downtown Association, and glad that we can offer 90 minutes of free parking to everyone. Onto the program. We're very thrilled tonight to have Christina Fernandez and Rosanna Alvarez in conversation for today's Creative Minds Talk. The talk tonight will be moderated by our assistant curator, Juan Omar Rodriguez. There will be time for Q&A from the audience at the end, after which Christina will be signing exhibition catalogs to your left. And if you enjoy today's program, which we are 100% positive you will, we have several more exciting programs coming in September, including the opening of 2 exhibitions, Calder at Home Among Friends, and Still in Motion, next Friday evening, along with a performance for First Friday by Milk Mom and Somnoke. Later in the month, join us for some country line dancing at City Dance on September 19th. And finally, tickets are available for our annual gala after party on Saturday, September 21st. It's the big party in San Jose, so don't miss it. Thanks. That's it from the official notes of institutional remarks, and I'll hand it over to Juan Omar now.
Hey, thank you so much for that introduction, Nidhi. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Juan Omar. A brief overview, I guess, of tonight's conversation. We have 2 amazing speakers, both storytellers working in a variety of media. We have Christina Fernandez, who's an artist featured in our current exhibition that takes place over all 3 of our upstairs galleries. The show is Christina Fernandez, Multiple Exposures, and it brings together 30 years of her work. If you haven't seen it, please spend some time after the talk today to look at her really incredible and layered works. We also have Rosanna Alvarez, who is an artist, a writer, educator, poet, and overall badass from San Jose, South Bay. So the talk will go from one speaker to the next. We'll focus on a very particular project from their very broad practice. The threads that we're kind of pulling together today are about storytelling and thinking specifically about how we think about the histories and politics of very particular spaces. Christina is from Los Angeles and Rosanna is from the South Bay, and so we're kind of linking these 2 areas from California through these conversations. So first, we'll start with the very incredible installation that we were able to add to this exhibition. Christina Fernandez, Multiple Exposures, was organized by Joanna Spitska at UCR Arts in Riverside, and the exhibition has been traveling throughout the United States. We were able to add this installation, which is not part of the original show, but helps to kind of connect Christina's practice, I think, very concretely with the agricultural and labor history of the Bay Area. So it's really exciting to be able to include this work. It also exemplifies another aspect of Christina's practice, which is her installation-based work. So with that bit of background, Christina, could you talk us about the genesis of this project and also share a little bit about how it's evolved over time? This is also for those of you who haven't seen it and are not as familiar with Christina's practice. This is the earliest work in the exhibition and also the most recent. So it really helps kind of bring the whole art career kind of full circle. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation because yes, it does sort of bracket the work in the show. I mean, as Juan mentioned, it's basically 30 years of my practice. The piece that we're talking about is about farm worker deaths and injuries due to pesticide and due to heat stroke because of global warming. The original work was a work I did in my undergrad class with Chris Burton. I don't know if anybody knows who Chris Burton is, but he was, you know, this amazing performative artist and eventually did sculptural work, but he was at UCLA. And I was taking a class with him, and at the same time, Cesar Chavez was doing a hunger strike to protest the use of pesticides in the fields that were poisoning and killing farm workers. And I thought that I should in some way acknowledge the work that he was doing and the subject matter for which he was starving himself. And so I was in Chris Burton's class. It was a new forms and concepts class, which meant video, performance, installation, that kind of thing. And at the time, those were really, you know, new forms. And I decided to take the information that my parents were getting in newsletters that were being sent to them by the UFW. They had been activists and UFW organizers, and take that information and type it onto index cards, and then as a performance, plant it into a dirt rectangle that sort of emulated rows of dirt, and then leave that installation or leave that performative work as a sculptural installation for a day, because we only had access to our gallery for one day, and then another student would take it over, right, subsequently. So it was a class. And so the work was up very briefly. It got a lot of support, and that was really great. I subsequently began going to Cal Arts for my master's degree and presented the same cards and information in photographic form. And so that's what the mural is. And you'll see it upstairs. So I photographed my brother's hand planting the cards into a landscape in miniature, basically. And then arranged a grid. The original photographs were 5 by 7. So the grid is rather small and only included 54 cards, where originally the installation had 80-something cards. Very differently from the UCLA experience, the Cal Arts experience was excruciating and terrible. And it inspired me to put the work away for a very, very long time. Occasionally, I would bring it out for like a Day of the Dead community arts kind of situation, but it kind of stayed in my file system, in my little, you know, archival file system for decades, really. And then I got an opportunity at the Benton Museum of Art to restage, or in a way reenact the installation, but with new cards. So the canvas or the wall mural has the pesticide deaths, very small amount of pesticide deaths in terms of like the overall impact of pesticide, right? It's just a small sampling. And then the cards that are in the dirt rectangle are newer deaths by heat stroke. So heat stroke has become an increasing problem with farm workers working in the middle of the day in the Central Valley in 110-degree weather. And so, and as you know, farm workers range in age from anywhere from like 15 to like 60 something, even 70 something. So these are the most vulnerable people. And I just wanted to do something that was more updated and also acknowledged the present problems that we're having. We still have problems with pesticide, but, and then, there was problems with COVID as well because farm workers live together in very close quarters. And then there's also been problems with workplace shootings as well. Heat, the close quarters, all add up to a lot of frustration, I think, sometimes. And so there is a card there about a workplace shooting that took place pretty close by, actually. And so it really does bookend 30 years of work. This piece was not quite 30, I don't know. Do the math. It was done in 1989, so originally it's, how many years is that, you guys? I'm horrible at math. I don't know, it's a lot.
30 some, 30.
Thank you. Anyways, all right, so that being said, it's not about me, right? And, expanding, 30 years of my work, blah, blah, blah. It's about the fact that there is still problems in the fields. That's what the problem is. And yeah, that hasn't been resolved, unfortunately, in 30-something years.
No, thank you for sharing that background and that kind of arc of how the work, how you, I guess, thought about the work.
You're welcome.
Something else I'm really interested in thinking about this installation in your broader practice is also like the way that it brings together different ways of thinking. So one part is your interest in performance and like kind of activating narratives in a sense. So with the first version of the work, you actually were first you typed all these stories, you kind of collated them together. They weren't, in this way, they were no longer separate incidents or isolated. You were trying to point to larger issues, creating kind of a community, thinking both about honoring, suffering, death, and kind of evoking the, I guess, almost like cemetery, but then also giving them new life again, transforming this into a gesture of mourning to one of hope and resilience, planting these stories to hopefully activate further work and conversation. And that's something you revisit again when you do this as a photographic series where you have your mother's hand actually making that intervention. So you're also thinking about time in this work. Row one was very ephemeral because of performance and the installation of what was going on for one day. You were thinking about how to extend the life of it potentially with collage or collage. Then you're also working with text, which is something you revisit in other works. And so I'm just wondering about how, I don't know, with this work you were really thinking about multiple ways of paying testimony with this and continuing to make narratives, I guess, stick with us. I don't know if that's something you want to respond to.
Well, I think in a way each of these cards is a story, right? A story of a person's life. And even the action that my brother took in planting the seeds was an emulative performance of the work that farm workers do, right? So I think it really is like one of the pieces that, in a way, doesn't necessarily need to be photographic, but it works well as a photograph with text. The text is reiterated in the photograph in many different ways. So, I've used text every once in a while, like particularly with Maria's Great Expedition, and which is also, very much about a family member. And so by extension, I think what I'm doing, or what I did with this piece is like, as you said, sort of create community by way of engaging with something that my family was very active in, right? Yeah, I grew up on picket lines. I didn't have a bite of head lettuce or a grape until I was well into adulthood. So our family was very committed to the cause. And in a way, the piece really does talk about, like, not only the people that have passed and the people that have been impacted by the negative conditions in the field, but also the huge community around all of that, like the support system, right? And I think that it's tough with political work or political work as art, like that proposition is problematic at best, right? And so I'm treading some weird line here, but I think it's worth it to bring the information to the museum space and to the museum goer who may not know that these things are happening. It seems incredible, but people don't know.
Thank you. And I think, this idea of thinking about how to bring this kind of information to an audience, how to confront, I guess, people with certain kinds of stories and make them feel something, or make them actually feel, in a sense, implicated. I think it's something interesting that would also resonate potentially with Rosanna's. On the slide, we have a picture of the cover of Rosanna's first poetry book.
Poetry book, yes.
Launched or published last year.
Last year. Won an International Book Award, not just for the words inside, for the Juan Felipe Herrera Best Book of Poetry Award, validating what I thought were my garbage poems, because I was like, these are not the good ones. But then Ada Limon in a workshop online, in the early days of her fancy new title, someone asked the question, well, what do you do with the old works that are no longer at the caliber in which you're writing? And she said, oh, they want to be in conversation. And so I printed all these papers out that I had accumulated through the years and had put away, and that at some points had been devalued or perceived as less than or not good enough, or that I had been invited to read on the radio with other poets, and then somehow I became the angry woman in the room, that everybody felt the need to explain that that was not them that I was addressing in these poems. And in some ways, I kind of feel like you need to be implicated in this work because it's all of us, and the burden cannot continue to fall on those of us who have this lived experience. So when I saw your piece, it messed me up in so many good ways, in so many grieving ways, in so many necessary ways, in ways that are mourning, right? And necessary, and ways that make me think about legacy. So when Juan Omar and Nini were like, oh, send us some stuff you might want to share, feels like an impossible task because I want to share everything. And so I thought it'd be fitting to put the cover there because I designed the artwork, and I also got, alongside that, a Best Cover Design Award for what I conjured up there. And what I conjured up there was implicating our responsibility to that next generation to do better. And everybody loves this cover. I know that's a broad, sweeping generalization, but it's easy to love because what's not to love of someone who's perceived as a child staring off into this very floral background. People love to love our culture, but they don't always love to love us. And so a lot of my poems are often in conversation with the visual art that, I feel like sometimes I'm channeling. And it feels like if the artwork comes first, the poem's gonna come next. And if the poem is brewing, it's because the visual is already starting to form. And they're having a conversation with each other. And so this piece, I feel like, to your various points of your powerful, evolving piece of work that is necessary for people to see, witness, feel some kind of way about, that frustration is still there because I'll share that poem in a bit, but we were organizing around migrant farm worker children's right to access their education during the pandemic. It took so long for people to even believe us and to not accuse us of having some kind of agenda for daring to call in the fact that people were, quite frankly, not doing their six-figure jobs. And so to hear from community who trust us, communities that we ourselves have sprouted from, right? So it feels like a lot has sprouted up while your piece was put away for 30 years, and bringing it back on time just feels like on cue, right, by some universal plan. But our names, right, were put in the school district memo saying, these people are going around rebel rousing, do not trust them. And I'm paraphrasing wildly, but it's the gist. We were put on notice. And so we proceeded to continue to organize. And the thing is, I have an older friend who says, you know, you can telephone or whatever, insert here, brilliant phrasings, and he's like, or you can tell a Chicana and guarantee and that's what we did, you know. And we called a lot of folks who understood, one, what it's like to be accountable to real people, and two, that if we were going and having conversations with families, they would tell us things that they wouldn't dare tell certain authorities for so many reasons having to do with vulnerability. And it's exhausting being angry and trying to stay sane and trying to show up with love. And that is exactly what we were trying to do, show up with love to tend to our communities. And so a lot of the poems that, you know, weren't trash because they were forged in and with community as my effort to bear witness to these things happening. Because if I was living through this and people were questioning my motives, and then by extension questioning our account of the facts, we were not trusted. And these are people that'll say, believe women all day long, wear the buttons, carry the flags, go to the Capitol and say, believe women, and yet every opportunity they have to believe a brown woman, just ain't it. And so things continue to be unjust. And during the pandemic, people were showing up at their best. And so I expected better from people. And maybe that was my mistake, but I continue to expect better from people. And so it is a risk to bear testament to something and to declare it in the moment. And to not let folks bury you in the dirt and say, we can't hear this. But best believe if you bury us in the dirt, we're down there and we're thinking and we're comfortable being grounded. And so for me, a lot of times when I'm having to mull over a word or a story or a feeling, I park it in a poem and give it its space. And sometimes it's more than one poem. So a lot of the poems in this book were around that dynamic and that experience. And with that particular school district, Gilbert Unified, I'm talking to you, about how they're treating brown kids in general. So symptom, cause, roots, really looking at what's rotten underneath, and it's not us. And hearing from so many of our youth before and after those moments of people who were led to believe that somehow it was us that were the rotten fruit. Somehow it was us that, you know, weren't worth more than dirt. And so I feel like a lot of me trying to bear witness and document what is happening to us and how we're feeling and validating it in writing is giving it space it needs for people to do something with it, even if that means feeling like they belong in a space. So you'll notice I love to play with words and design like a math equation. It could be graded belonging, graded longing, graded unbelonging, but we're grappling with that dynamic constantly through the words in the book. And so the poem that I was like, you know what, this needs to be shared today is around this idea of pearly gates. And aside from the work that you listed, Juan Omar, I do a lot of volunteer work. And it's tiring, but it's also beautiful, and it's also a way to hold us accountable on a systems-wide scale. And one of my biggest frustrations is being an artist on the ground and then having fancy narratives and practices and policies that I've had a hand in shaping be used against me when I speak some injustice. It's wild, and it happens in places that I respect. And what folks don't understand is if I am telling you about this dynamic and my experience, at the bottom of this totem pole, and you're using the stuff that I had a hand in shaping at the top, something's broken. And I wonder how many other voices are being silenced because they don't have that same perspective or that same access. And so I have to say something. And this one was inspired by kind of the convergence, the crossroads of those dynamics, and it's called Pearly Gates. When they beam with pride for having uplifted Dolores Huerta but can't name farm workers in their community and reluctantly tolerate activists barely maybe pretentious pretense nudging her out, this work's not for you. They've never seen us in the streets devalue the voice of community porque no somos iguales, we're not the same. Forget who was there too, pretend they've never furrowed their brow as they softly talk over you so they can give voice. While admiring and adoring the work of Frida Kahlo with hands to chest and concerned puppy dog eyes, there's no room for the Chicana artist across the table. And zooming to your left, something about how the people need something they can relate to, maybe less abrasive, less angry, less you, while genuinely concerned with barriers and access, whitewashing the issues. It's easier to swallow that way. And then again, not to be confused, right? Because when we use certain language to call in injustices and how we might resolve it, people confuse that, or I might be combative or closed-minded, and I'm like, no, I'm saying these words and I'm documenting these words because they need to be said and heard in these spaces so that we can talk about it, so that we can do something about it, so that we can stop asking us to bury it as complicit parties to what you're asking us to swallow. And I heard a poet earlier this week, I think they posted it on Facebook, and they said something like, to be a poet is to fall in love with words. And I thought about it and I was like, I really do love words. But I think for me, to be a poet is to be in love with community. And to have so much love for community that sometimes I have to speak some spicy truths so that we can do better. Spicy truth. Otherwise, there'd be no point in me even saying it. I just take it for what it was, right? And so me saying these things when it feels like a call out is in fact a call in. It's an act of care, not just for my communities, but for all of us. It's an effort to dialogue, and it's an effort to start with at least documenting the truth. And so I also was like, can we put this photograph because we were there? The newspaper didn't want to cover it. It's a smaller town. There's less variety. There's less folks paying attention to what we're doing. At the time, I lived in Gilroy, and so now I live in Hollister, but we had Hollister paper coming out saying, we're really curious about what's happening here, and we're also very confused. And they came and they checked it out. The Gilroy paper refused to cover it, refused to talk about it, but they sure as heck did take note that after this protest in March that we did, that not many people came to, we had a town hall. And since then, there have been so many town halls had in that town, so I'm like, you're welcome. And I hear various different versions of inspiration for how these things have happened, but it is helpful that at least that changed, right? And of course, there was a little bit of movement in getting the kids to access their education, but there's still a lot unresolved. And so I think it's also important when we have our pictures that we're taking, just to make sure we're not crazy, right? Like we were there, like this actually happened, to not be erased. And I think artwork has the capacity to kind of trace back those things that there's a refusal or a loss, because sometimes we do document them and it's just lost or it's not preserved. And so just being able to find different angles to still leave some of those clues, right? I think for me is critical in terms of why I do this work. I have kids and I'm constantly thinking about what will they have accessible to them to remember who we are as human beings? And what will they have accessible to remember what they need to in terms of the lessons for having these hard conversations? And so I'm invested. I'm invested deeply because I love my community.
Thank you so much for that, Rosanna. And I think some of the last words you mentioned, and you connect me back with Christina's work too, specifically with Maria's great tradition. I'm just thinking first, you're also a lover of words, Christina. Where with this installation, you were very adamant about not just working with images, but really working with installation. The plethora of the rest of the world is actually like coming to play, I guess, with this kind of work. But then also, going back to Rosanna's poem where she mentions being a icon, and thinking about, the icons that exist that allow for certain kinds of tokenization, and sometimes there's no other connection, I guess, with particular figures from specific communities. I'm thinking about how, with this project, you're thinking about a particular ancestor, and thinking about how to recover the story in a sense, to provide some other kind of map for, history, the kind of people we can claim in our, I guess, legacies and genealogies. But then you're also thinking about the difficulty of preserving what has already been lost. I'm wondering if you can discuss more about how you came about through the research of this project. If I remember correctly, you only had 2 photographs in Bahia.
Yeah.
Of your family.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that this piece sort of came into being was the Mexican Museum in San Francisco had commissioned John Noriega to do an exhibition. Do an exhibition, is that better? Okay. Curate an exhibition of Chicano narrative photography, which addressed like the Southwest, or a narrative of the Southwest. And he had asked me to create a work, and so then I wanted to do something about my great-grandmother who came over virtually by herself, and she was a middle-class young woman. She was 14 years old from Michoacan, and she got pregnant, unmarried, which is very problematic back then, and for a middle-class young woman. And so I had heard about her. She was kind of legendary in my family. She was my mother's father's mother, so my great-grandmother. She died fairly young, and when I asked about photographs of her, there were only 2. She had lost a lot of her archive or her not her archive, but her, her stuff. She lost a lot of her stuff that she was taking from town to town in a flood. So we didn't have really anything to go by. And so what I ended up doing was interviewing my family members who knew her and writing down their stories, recording their stories, trying to make sense of her migration narrative and her life, and distilling it down to the important and big events in her life, but also contextualizing the story within a social and political framework. Both a woman's framework, immigration framework, family, war, all these things that were going on while she was making her journey throughout the Southwest from Michoacan. Because there were no photographs, or there were 2 photographs, I really felt like I couldn't do much with that. So I have been named after her. Her name is Maria, obviously. And my middle name is Maria. So, and my grandfather had told me I looked a lot like her. He would get drunk and give me money and tell me I looked like his mother. So I decided, well, I'm going to reenact her life in a way performing the family and performing identity. And so I wrote the narrative first. So if you go upstairs and read, and it's not a lot of reading, you guys. You can read it, and it's an interesting story. Once I wrote the narrative, I formulated the photographs. And so the photographs grow out of the story, which is both social and political and personal, right, about her life. The other thing that I did with the reenactment was, in a sense, like embody her, right? So I'm embodying her, becoming her in these photographs. And I'll often talk about Maria in like, you know, third person, like she really exists in those photographs. It's really kind of weird. The act of performing somebody else's identity, right, and their story is a really incredible experience, actually. This work took place over a year and a half, 2 years, and it was exhibited at the Mexican Museum in a show that Tanya Noriega curated along with Harry Gamboa's work and some other really, Miguel Gander, Delilah Montoya, some really amazing Chicana photographers. So the way that I envisioned the piece was more like a natural history museum display. So like if you go, for instance, if you're ever in LA, you go to the Autry Museum of Art, or Autry Museum of Western History, you'll see, you know, people's lives sort of documented in this way. And so that was what I was shooting for with the installation. And I do consider this an installation piece. It's not just photographs hanging on a wall with text next to it, right? It's, you're supposed to treat it as if you're really looking at Maria and you're really learning about her, and she's like this iconic figure, right? So I'm taking that, you know, family, personal story and sort of blowing it up into this sort of overarching, iconic, Maria is a symbol of many Marias, right? And it just so happened that her name was Maria. Maria is a very common name, right, in Mexico, so that worked out. And also there's a map that accompanies the story that sort of charts her journey, and it's named Maria's Great Expedition because I was sort of positing her as an explorer in a sense, right? Even though she has indigenous roots, you know, she's a mestiza, but she's also Spanish, right? Like so many from Mexico are, we're Spanish, Basque, Portuguese, and then we're Mixtec, or whatever, you know, we chol. So I'm using this sort of, in this particular image, sort of, you know, a rebozo, you know, she's got her braids, but she's also a lighter skinned Mexican woman, and then she's going on this expedition, right? So, you know, identity as a Mexican can be fairly complex, like how we identify who we side with on our ancestral DNA is complex. And as you know, in Mexican families and any Latino family, you'll have a very light-skinned person and then a very dark-skinned person. People often ask me, well, you're light-skinned. What do you mean? You're talking about this, or talking about race, or talking about, but yet, you know, my brother's dark, because we have these familial experiences of DNA is crazy. And so I just felt like I want to own this sort of ambiguity within these photographs, right? Where she looks more Americanized in some photographs, and more indigenous in others, and more classically mestiza in others, right? Because we, all of us, kind of live that way, right? And so this is why the costume changed and why she looks so different in every photograph, right? And her style of dress changes, and she looks more Americanized in other photographs. That's something I don't talk about often with this series, but I think it's kind of an important point when it comes to identity and how we identify and whose stories we're telling, all of that. So the piece is meant to be somewhat iconic. It's meant to take the personal and make it into the meta, you know, make it into an overarching story about migration and be a migration story of a woman who was single, who raised her family. Maria was also a person that rejected the Catholic Church. My family is not Catholic at all. My cousin over there. She did not feel that it fit her lifestyle. She wanted freedom. You know, she wanted to be independent. She had to leave because she was pregnant. And it was because of all this religiosity around pregnancy and marriage and, you know, and she really never got married. She had partners. Yeah. Yeah, I'm living that life right now. But anyways. So there's a lot of things that went into the piece that are kind of unsaid and unspoken, but I think they emerge. I think people kind of get that, especially when they read the narrative.
Yeah, something that I think is really interesting about three works, you know, thinking about how you're thinking about them as archetypes and how they can be stories that are not just your own, they're not personal, but they can be shared. You're also thinking a lot about like the tensions between thinking about this as borrowing the forms of something that's supposed to be tactic, you know, something that has a certain type of authority, but then also introducing things that point to the fiction of it, point to the fact that this is performance, that this is all.
Yeah, all those anachronisms in
Yes.
the photographs.
For one, yeah. The newspaper.
Yeah, the 99-cent newspaper.
Yes. But you're also, you know, kind of, in other ways, very fluidly, I guess, bringing this up, because each image also represents kind of a different era of photography.
Yeah.
So we have Great Depression era documentary,
Yes.
we have Hollywood camera shots,
Yeah.
and then the amateur color snapshot. So thinking about the way that photography has been authored by different people,
Yeah.
institutions, for very different means. So just again, bringing to question the fact that this is a photographic series and it's not supposed to be factual in a sense. It's not supposed to be. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
My words are failing. Just pointing to the fact that this is very stylized. A lot of these are staged in a sense.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they're exclusively staged. Yes.
Yes. I have another question there, but
That's okay.
we'll just keep it going.
They can also go upstairs and look at it.
Yes.
Experience it.
So turning back to Rosanna, but thinking about kind of the work that Christina was doing, to think about our family history and how to kind of connect it with official histories and kind of show particular kinds of tensions between what is experienced and what is learned, in a sense. You have this poem that talks a little bit about inheritance and legacy. You also have an image here with it. I don't know if you want to start.
Yes, it's funny because that image actually it's in the book in black and white, but it correlates, is in conversation with a completely different poem about parenting capable bodies, but there's something again about like the conversation happening across time and space, and when you revisit a thing, how it morphs, and I feel like that's why art is so powerful, because context of the experience, it does matter. But this particular poem, I was thinking about when Christina was talking right now about how we identify, and I think part of the question is also who do we identify, even as people. It's wild, right? Like we'll acknowledge humanity and people, and we're here for the kids, but then when folks have the opportunity to really show up, suddenly it gets complicated. And so I'm constantly trying to ground myself in how uncomplicated it is as I'm complicatedly raising my own kids in a family context and history where, I think the reason why my exhibition resonates so deeply is because I had grandmothers who, if I wrote their story, they'd be considered trailblazers. They were doing things that were not considered, demure and ladylike. My 12-year-old's gonna counsel me for using that word here. But, and it's complicated because that family history is not just, the migration patterns that we learn about anywhere, because there's a convergence in my lineage where we didn't just travel, I have an abuelita from Michoacan, Mercedes, and she came up here in the trunk of a car, and she was the boss of everything. She was the boss of everything. And I didn't get to have her for as long as I would have liked to ask her versions of these stories. And so I find that I'm just getting clues and snippets and threads, and I'm having to figure out how to weave them into a bigger story of who she was, not just as my abuelita, but as a woman and as a person. And my grandma, same thing. I got to spend a lot of time with her too while she was here, but again, lost her in my early 20s to stomach cancer, and it's probably a result of the pesticides in the field. So again, recognizing who I am as a woman and wanting and craving certain lessons from them so that I can pass on to my daughters who are very outspoken and I feel like activate a lot of traits that my grandmothers held for me unbeknownst to them, right? It's all filtered through how they perceive me and the lessons that shaped me. And in being in a lot of spaces, when we're talking about populations, we talk about communities of farm workers, communities of parents, communities of immigrants, communities of domestic violence survivors, and we're reluctant to reckon with the fact that these communities have leaders, and those leaders have names. And for me, those leaders were my abuelitas. Everybody in the McCreary neighborhood close to the plaza would be like, ¿Dónde está esta Doña Mercedes? Because I need a sobada, right? Like, people knew. And the same thing, my grandmother Ruth, she fed people. And in fact, when we were gathering the little cue cards to try to make Cesar Chavez a holiday, she was like, Mija, I cooked for him, let me tell you something, right? So I had her for snippets of real good story, both of them. And so I feel like part of this is trying to document as much as I can in a family context where we don't talk about Bruno, we talk about a lot of things and a lot of people, and we don't want to talk about the real, raw, hard, actual things that shape us in life, because so many reasons, you know. And that could be a whole dissertation. So I park it in a poem instead, because I'm like, I don't have time for that. And I think about my grandmothers being decent people and upstanding citizens and civically engaged in ways that are often not counted or qualified or quantified. And so the poem goes, if you listen closely, you can hear it, almost a hum, the whoosh of the drum, bridging across space and time, reverberating stories of this land's survival, resilience, joy through hostility, a constellation of so many beautiful weaves. Stories of sacrifice, imposed resilience, calloused hands, stiffened backs, our grandmothers, 7 generations forward and 7 generations back, of gente remembered, connected to the land, babies who howled at the moon and handmade tortillas better than any spoon. You see, my grandmothers, Ruth and Mercedes, carried poetry in their names, birthed poetry past all of their pains, from El Limón, Michoacán, and Las Cruces, Nuevo Mexico, stories encoded in these very veins. Del rancho y del campo, they held my hands through these very streets, might have swerved in some of these lanes, celebrated with ranchera beats, de gente decente, a few with names etched into stone, past the ones we already know out in Santa Paula, for the riches of citrus they never owned, and the photographs of marching with those red little flags made their way north where the sun never lags. Mushroom plant stories to circuit board glories, then Monte Canaries never mind their salaries. And the drum, it still calls on me, syncs up with the heartbeat, anchors my sanity, tugs on my rusty feet, reminding me to connect with planted seeds, sometimes mistaken for hostile weeds, calls on me to remember. Remember, mija, remind them. And so, remembrance takes up a lot of space in my poetry, and sometimes I just need to remember, you know? I think when we're met with injustice, I always hear people be like, do you know who I am? And they never think that we can say that. We know who we are, and the parts that we don't know, we're comfortable getting in the dirt and excavating and trying to work it out. And I feel like I do that kind of publicly because I also work with students, college students who come with all of their stories. And it's important for them to kind of see this imperfect person fumbling through the dirt trying to figure it out, that's not afraid to throw on some feathers and go out there barefoot and, you know, callous up these feet in prayer for our communities. And really doing right by the sacrifices that weren't just, you know, immigrant experience from Michoacan, but also included a choice. My grandmother made a choice. My great-grandmother made a choice to leave her relationship and make her way from Nuevo Mexico to Texas to California and have my grandmother, you know, follow and trail behind her, also leaving an abusive relationship and then coming here and eventually settling up in San Jose. And so that pattern tells a different story than the ones I'm often told to presume about my own communities. So I feel like these art forms allow space for that even to enter people's mind, so that it's not just all immigrants have some same pattern, you know? Like, I love the red thread that's like, she went a little up north, she came a little south, and she was on this expedition. And I think that for a lot of women, that resonates for so many reasons. And for as much as you were like, you don't need to be in response, but we're in conversation, and I feel like even unbeknownst, right? Because these things I had shaped and made before seeing Maria's expedition, and to see that there, for me, it feels like a conversation where I'm revisiting my artistry and my craft and seeing the layers that now I am interpreting, and that those are influencing what comes next and how I look back to what was already created then.
Yeah, I think a lot of the imagery that you have in your words. Thank you for reminding me. A lot of the imagery that you have in your poetry is very much things that I'm thinking of when I think about my own work. Like, a lot of the same iconography is there, and I love that. Yeah, I didn't know about your works, and I'm really loving hearing it. And it's spoken by you. Yeah.
Have you, so I don't know if you've ever encountered this question, but like when I'm in teaching spaces and people will start dropping names of like historical icons, and they'll be like, do you know such and such? Oh, you teach women's studies. Do you know so-and-so? And I'm like, ma'am, do you know so-and-so? And so I feel like even this poem was a little bit of, do you know my grandmas? No, right? Like who we uphold and uplift and who we're expected to know the stories of.
Right. I mean, I think obviously, you know, those histories are distilled and considered important for whatever reasons. But I think when we make art about our families, they all of a sudden get transformed into these almost iconic figures, right? So your family stories and the figures that you talk about are in these books, and they get dispersed all over the place, right? People read them, they're bookstores, or, you know, whatever. And then Maria has been everywhere. And literally, I mean, Maria's story is everywhere. She's still on an expedition, you know. She was in Princeton, she was in Scottsdale. Smithsonian, Washington, D.C., I mean, we could go on. But because we are the creative people of our family and we're the ones that do the work, right? I'm not sure that you're the only one that does that work in your family.
If we're right now.
Yeah.
You're trying to plant those seeds.
Right, exactly. So in my family, I really am, on my mother's side, the only person that does this kind of work, like really excavating the family history and really using that in my work and transforming the life of my ancestors into something very solid and iconographic and very emblematic, right? And so I think we maybe lie to ourselves a little bit when we say, you know, every little detail is important, you know. No. Yeah. I mean, you have to edit a little bit, right? And focus on the things that we regard as amazing or different or whatever it may be, right? Because, you know, there's so much that goes into a person's life that is just like everybody else's life. And that in itself is heroism, right? It's heroic. But I think we make really smart decisions about how do we talk about this person's life in a way that others are drawn into it, right?
Definitely.
But also at the same time, relate to it. So it's still real enough to be relatable, right? And so when we're told things like, oh, do you know this person or that person, you know? And I'm like, well, yeah, exactly. Do you know me? Do you know my great-grandmother's story? And I worked really hard on that. And it paid off, you know, it paid off. And so I think that everybody in the family, everybody has somebody in their family that was, or maybe even several people in their family that did heroic things, you know, to bring them to whatever it may be, whether it was here, or bring them into the middle class, or bring them to education, or whatever it may be. And they did heroic things. They worked really, really hard. They did things that required a lot of courage and required them to be uncomfortable in many, many spaces, right? I think that's the biggest thing, actually. So, yeah, anyways. I love that, yeah, that we're kind of like, there's a mirroring that's happening with your stories and my visual art.
Not quite stopping the conversation yet, but I know there are many, many fans of both your works, Rosanna and Christina. So I want to give the audience a chance to ask you both questions. Just take a few questions before we jump into the book signing. And does anyone have any? Yes, thank you. Brave soul.
The first person.
Hello. Thank you both, number one, for your words and experience and like being up here today. It's really powerful and moving. One thread that I've heard throughout your conversation that came up like in May in the beginning, and as I kind of followed through, is this idea of being a witness. And thinking of Christina, your work, I see so many different kinds of witnessing, whether it's like very quiet witnessing of like the first piece that we saw. And Rosanna, like you bringing up like your activist past and your activist like not just past, like present. A question that's in my head is, because I'm a teacher, I love definitions, and I love personal definitions. How would each of you define what it is to be a witness and how that implicates us?
I'm going to let Rosanna take that first.
Well,
Yeah, that's why I'm letting you take it.
ever since I was a child, I was a snitchity snitch. I learned in my teen years, snitches get stitches, so then we recalibrated. And now I bear witness. I think that there is something powerful of even bearing witness to our own stories because we've been taught to tuck away so much. And then how I conceptualize myself is very community oriented. And so me even just being able to say, these are the things that I am experiencing are oftentimes, these are the things we are experiencing in community. And yes, we were there, and yes, we are taking the time to taste life twice, even the bitter. And so being able to come back to it in a visual way, whether it's words or images, or even just colors on a canvas or a textile stitch, that took a turn that needed to. There's something about being able to go back and making it take up space so that it can hopefully almost serve as I was gonna say invitation, but incantation is what comes to mind next, right? It's almost like it's healing self to just being able to say, yes, this happened. Even if it's just, we stood around this tree, that happened, and that we had the ability to do that, because oftentimes we don't. So the layers of that, and then like what it means to do that with creative freedom and flexibility, kind of what Christina was talking about. Like, there are some, you want to, you're creating an art form, an art piece, a written word, and so you want it to have resonance. And for me, I want it to have resonance and relatability, and I want it to call you in to a conversation, call you into a recollection, a memory, a reconciliation sometimes. So I think bearing witness just is powerful in that way, and being able to meet people where they are. And I don't mean that in terms of ability, but I mean in spaces where we feel we can engage, because I don't aim to exhibit in a museum. I'm not in a space where that feels as good as I would like it to for me, for several reasons. So I often will create things that are purposefully going to live like as a sticker on someone's car or their water bottle, so that it could daily kind of conjure up whatever conversation that person is having. And so thinking through how these things are an ongoing invitation to engage past the time that you're bearing witness so someone else can bear witness. I think it's a layered approach for me.
So I think, bearing witness is different than observing, right? But I'm an observer. I think all photographers are observers. We necessarily observe in order to create our work, right? And so that's endemic to photography and to practice, right? But there's all kinds of ways of observing with photography. So you could do social documentary, right? Which is something I don't really do. I kind of twist, I do a turn on social documentary, because my work is in the spirit of social documentary in a lot of ways, because it's political, and oftentimes social documentary work, photographically speaking, is also political or activist in nature. But I think what I do with the work that pulls it apart from this, or takes it apart from the social documentary aspect, is that I take the body out. Because you'll notice that there's not a lot of bodies in my photographs. The bodies that you can see clearly are me, So I am in place of the other bodies, right? And use myself in a way as almost like an iconic figure and iconic body that is a stand-in, right, for my community. And the reasons I do that are plentyfold, because there's lots of problems for me with social documentary photography. So bearing witness is different for me in that I observe, like I am observing what is going on, right? And I'm processing it through my practice, right? In a certain way. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you for the question.
And we're gonna just take one more audience question who was very quickly flamed already.
Oh, good, I get the last question. Okay, Christina, you mentioned this, and thank you to both of you and to the museum, but you mentioned about the variety of skin colors that we come in. And I'm just wondering if either one of you have either approached that subject in your art, in your work, because I have found in my personal experience, sometimes the lighter skinned person has to spend time justifying, explaining, and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes they get a little too much praise for it. Mira la güera tan chula, So I'm just wondering if that has come to you in what you've done or something like that. Thank you.
Good question.
I don't think I've directly addressed it in my work in terms of like skin color, but like if you look at the Untitled Farmworkers canvas piece, the one that's on the wall in Colmar, that's my brother's hand. All of that is my brother's hand. But you'll notice that it's done in different shades of brown, right? From darker to lighter to more red to more yellow. And that was achieved through different exposures when I was photographing. Because I was conscious that we all come in different shades of brown, right? And so I'm enacting that within the photographic image of the same hand. And you'll notice my brother has a little hangnail,
Yeah.
and it appears in every single but yet he has different shades of skin, right? And then in Untitled Multiple Exposures, which is the piece that I did photographing myself and then photographing iconic photographs of indigenous women by famous Mexican photographers, you'll notice that my lighter skin, because of the way that black and white photography works, kind of eclipses or takes over the image, which is something that is a rhetoric within the image. It speaks, right? Because in actuality, this is what happens, right? In all media in Mexico, right? The lighter skin takes over, right? And not because it's better or good, but because people have a certain concept of what lighter skin is, right?
Right.
And so that work, you know, is a little bit messy and talks about that a little bit in a way that reflects the reality of what it's like to be a lighter skinned person in a darker skinned family or in a darker skinned community, right? And so I don't directly address the issue of skin color in my work, but it's there because it is part of our community. It's something that we talk about often, at least in my family. It's something that operates in reality, right? You know, I can drive a car with a busted headlight for years, and then my brother takes the car and he gets pulled over within 2 seconds. You know, it's like, this is the things that happen to our darker skinned family members all the time. So, yeah, that's interesting, but I have not done work that specifically does skin color.
It's funny because as I was walking out of the house, my 12-year-old thought she was being funny, and it was funny. You know, calling in my Wednesday Addams color coded.
Wednesday.
You're so
Which
boss,
is
oh
like,
my gosh.
I don't know what she said about bye mom, have fun with your no shade of brown, and I was like, how dare you? But in my family, like, I think it's also context and how we conceptualize and how we live these experiences in idea and in reality. Because I'm recognized brown as soon as I walk out. I mean, look at me. It doesn't matter that my skin is pasty. Like, I purposefully put signifiers very loudly. And sometimes when I open my mouth, depending on whether or not I want to use my customer service voice, because I do indeed have one, and can get things done in this kind of tone and intonation. Or if I'm just really comfortable and I'm like, all right, students, let's get it done today because I have no patience to filter, and this is how I speak when I'm at home and I'm at home. So I think there's also like different codes for brown, right?
Yeah.
And I grew up not being as güerita as some of my cousins. And so for me, I was always like, Mom, why did the paletero call me güerita? Like, my hair is brown. Like, I don't understand. And it's conceptualization of the experience, right? And in some spaces, I'm not as light as some relatives, and in other spaces, I am the pastiest one in the room. And so, you know, that leads to conversations around, well, what does it mean? Like, why does so-and-so have blue eyes and blonde hair? Because that's how my abuelita was. What do you want from me? Like, I didn't choose him. My abuelita did. Take it up with her. And so, and then thinking about how, like, my mom is darker skinned and she gets confused for being from Indian culture, not Mexican, and people are surprised when she speaks Spanish. So even being brown in that way, she is dismissed as a cultural ambassador until she proves, you know, for her. So I think it's complicated. All that to say, it's complicated. And I think what I do grapple with and reckon with and try to reconcile is how much of us is just not seen beyond skin tone. Because I think we live in a society that is comfortable thinking we're addressing our, you know, phenotype discrimination, and then we don't want to talk about anything else of how it manifests in all these other ways. And then I will have people be like, well, look at you and your spaces of privilege. And I'm like, exactly my point. If this is the experience I'm living, what have we not reconciled? What have we not faced? What have we not what have we refused to see and acknowledge in everyone else, whether it be monolingual Spanish speakers, whether it be, some of our neighbors in Hollister who speak Mixteco and not Spanish and can't get a cultural translator. So I'm thinking of all of those ways that brown shows up. Not just color, but in all of those kind of situations. And so, aside from figuring out, well, how do we reconcile issues of identity with ourselves, I think it's how do we implicate power systems and structures, and how do we really look at past me, myself, and I, and how I'm unpacking my identity, how we reconcile the we with all of that complicated stuff that we carry into these spaces, buildings, institutions, practices, educational, breaks that make our people in community think that they will never be able to learn to read and that they are not readers and that they don't enjoy art and they are not for the museum. So I feel like I'm constantly battling that, and I'm constantly giving people an entry point. People will say to me often, I don't like poetry, I'm off. Do you love you some Tupac? Do you love you some rap? Let me tell you, right? There's the linkage. And for me, like when I was teaching 9th grade verbal reasoning, which were the push-out kids who had trouble reading because they couldn't identify with things they were being asked to read, a while back, so I was like, let's look at most deaf. And then for most deaf, they were like, get down, Dr. Seuss be rapping too. And then we were able to get to the good stuff, poetry, right? Or like when I tell people, Tupac would have been a poet, but he needed to survive, so he chose gangster, and he says that. I would have liked to have been a rapper, but my mom would have had me real good, and regardless of my pastiness. And so I'm with some inclination to still speak the truth, unfiltered. And I take liberty to do it in spaces I see fit, whether it's your clothes, whether it's your words, whether it's a sticker or a decal or an entire co-founding of a magazine where we can invite other people to, yes, you have stories to tell. Yes, I recognize that, you walk down the street and you look a certain way and you interface with systems in such a way that you feel like you don't belong, but your story belongs here because this is your community. And in the face of growing displacement, especially in places like East San Jose right now, because gentrification hits hard, it's important to remind people of every coded brown way of facing our reality, including the messy, but the beautiful. Because I think, like even my grandmothers, I'm revisiting their stories and I'm like, okay, we started with the good things, but I know they must have some messiness in there that I would love to imagine, right? So I gotta call it fiction because I can't verify any of these family chismes that are messy. But that's what I get to explore next. So it's also like what layers of permission based on where I am in my storytelling with community and how that's received, that I could feel like I can do this right, and giving myself that permission and making sure that I feel like I'm still doing this from a space of integrity that still kind of is trying to challenge certain things that show up like injustice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna, for your words and sharing your support.
Can I have one more question? Just kidding, just kidding.
I was gonna go, I have to go on a restroom break.
I was teasing her.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Christina will be signing her catalog as well as anything you want her to sign, really.